Hey there! In today's video, I have a small drop leaf table that I picked up off of Facebook Marketplace for $25. This guy's in good shape overall, other than the watermarks and failing finish in just a few places. Its biggest issue is the fact that it's orange. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to go from this to this, using water-based aniline dye and an oil-based stain as a glaze. If you're a friend of the channel, welcome back. If you're new here, welcome to The Flipping Husband. My name's Andy. It's nice to have you. And this channel is where I take old unwanted furniture, I either refinish it or restore it to give it a new lease on life. The easiest way for me to work on a piece like this is to break it down into its individual pieces. But before I do that, I definitely want to mark the hinges and the different drop leaves on this. So when it's time to put it back together, I'll know just how these pieces went together. And I go ahead and put all of my hardware into bags to keep them organized and safe until I'm done with the project. And different pieces of hardware are different sizes, and I'll actually use different bags for those, so I can be sure to know which screw goes with which part. In addition to marking the hardware, I made a quick note on the piece itself where the hinges go, and this will be covered up when I'm done. You'll never see these markings. They're there just for my own purpose, to keep things straight. I repeated this process for the other drop leaf and then changed my focus to these little clips that are holding the base onto the top. This is a pretty common way to attach an apron to a tabletop. There are small metal clips that go into a groove in that apron. And this is a really great way to make that connection. It allows the top that will expand and contract over the season with different humidity levels to move without cracking. And this hardware gets its own bag. So when it comes time to put this back together, I'm sure not to use some hinge hardware to reattach the top to the apron base. I removed both of the drop leaf support brackets. I'm going to finish these in a different color than the base, so I just wanted to separate them to make that refinishing process that much easier. The base of this bracket pivots on a wooden dowel, and around that dowel is a metal washer. Now, I did think about cutting this whole sequence out of the video, but sometimes I think these videos are edited to make these jobs look real easy. And there is a reality of finishing furniture that's old and been around for a while, and sometimes the parts just don't want to come apart. So it did take me 3 minutes or so to actually get this washer off. And then when I was done, I did take some sandpaper and I sanded that dowel down just a little bit. So when it's time to put this thing back together, it will slide over just a little bit easier. And some simple numbering will help me get these parts back on the correct side when it's time to do the reassembly. Because the pieces are so small, I clamped them down to my workbench and used a folded up piece of shop towel to prevent damaging the top unnecessarily. And what I was trying to do here is simply remove the top finish off of these pieces. I could have used a chemical stripper. In the end, I decided to give the Carbide Scraper a go, and boy, I'm glad I did. I realized really quick into this process that the scraper wasn't just taking the top coat off, but it was actually removing the finish from the piece, and that these are, in fact, solid maple boards. And maple can have some real beautiful grain pattern to them. And by scraping them, I'm going to be raising that grain just enough that I'm hoping the finish will capture some of that and give kind of a hand-planed look to the tops of this drop leaf. At least that's my goal right now. We'll see how that actually turns out when I get to the finishing step. There's a lot of profile detail on this little table. So I went ahead and ordered Profile Scraper off of Amazon. And although the profile of the scraper didn't match exactly the curvature of this edge, I was able to scrape most of that finish off by just going lightly over it and varying the angle of the scraper. And it did a pretty good job of removing the finish on all of the different surfaces. After I was done with the scraping process, I grabbed 120 grit paper and worked my way around the edge of the piece, cleaning up all of the little spots that the scraper didn't get to. I grabbed my DeWalt palm sander with a 220 grit paper and used it to clean up the rest of this edge profile. I also went ahead and finished the sanding on the tops of these 3 individual pieces, just looking to take the rest of that finish off. I made a spontaneous decision to strip the finish off of these support brackets, and I plan to finish them the same color as the top. And my son Noah swung by to say hello. And I'm thinking having these brackets match the top of the table will give a nice contrast between the base and the top. But you guys will definitely have to let me know if I was able to pull this look off in the comments when we get this done. I do go ahead and clean the base using my simple green and some warm water and looking to get all that grime and grease off before I put the milk paint on. For the base of this table, I ordered up some old-fashioned milk paint from Amazon. This comes in a powder form, and you simply mix as much as you think you might need, equal parts milk paint to water, and then give it a pretty good mix. Now I'll normally mix this paint in a mason jar, and you can just combine the water and the powder and shake it. Although I couldn't find the little metal top to my mason jar, so I ended up using a fork and a little plastic sandwich tray. You'll want to mix this until all of the powder is dissolved in the water. It takes just a couple of minutes. You can adjust the consistency of the milk paint by adding more or less water. In fact, don't be surprised if you find yourself adding just a couple of tablespoons of water as you work through your project, because this paint will thicken up as it sits. Now, application is just like any other paint. It's going to take at least 2 coats, so don't be too concerned with the first coat. And it's more of an application than a paint. You're not worried about brush strokes at this point. This is going to dry to a pretty flat black finish, so it's more about applying the paint and keeping the surface smooth as you work your way around the project. Now, I really love this milk paint. It's almost no VOCs, so there's no odor. It's non-toxic, doesn't require a primer, and it gives a fabulous flat look when you're done. I'll go ahead and drop a link to the paint that I purchased from Amazon in the description below. I'll be staining the top of this table using an aniline dye. This is a water-soluble powder that you mix with hot water, and you can combine different colors to get a custom look. What I'm using today is a mix between a red and a brown, and it gives this beautiful, kind of a deep red with brown undertone look. And the thing that I really like about a wood dye is it doesn't mask the natural grain of the wood itself. It's actually going to be enhancing the grain of this maple. Any water-soluble finish is going to raise the grain of your piece that you're working on. And you have a couple of options to address this. You can go ahead and coat your piece with water and let it dry before you apply any finish, and then give a light sanding. And after that grain raises once, any subsequent applications of water will not raise the grain. I use the first coat of dye as my grain raising coat. And after it dries, I'll go over the piece with a very light sanding, the 320 or above sandpaper, just to knock down that raised grain. Dyes are super easy to apply. There's no need to worry about brushing in any one direction. You just need to put the product on, let it set for 5 or 10 minutes, and then come back with a shop towel and wipe off any of the standing water that may be left. And then give the piece a good 3 hours to dry. Depending on temperature and humidity, it may take longer. And then you'll want to go ahead and apply a second coat. And that's really where you're going to start to see the benefits of these water-based dyes. I want to make sure that the 2 drop leaves match the same color tone as the centerpiece of this table. So I'm being very careful not to allow this center to sit any longer or shorter than I used for the 2 side pieces. I can make some modifications when it comes to the second coat, but it's a good idea to use the same time profile for each piece to make sure you end up with a very similar tone in the end. I applied the same dye to both of the drop leaf support brackets. And after a couple of minutes, I came back with my shop towel and wiped off any of the excess water. And this is what it looks like after that first coat of aniline dye has had a chance to dry. It looks very similar to where I started, but trust the process. This is going to look fantastic when I'm done. But at this point, I do need to take a light sanding and knock down any of that raised grain that was the result of that first coat of the water-based dye. With that step completed, I can move right into the second coat of dye on these 3 pieces. And this is really where you're going to start to see some depth of color develop through this process, while at the same time, you're not going to be masking the natural grain of these boards. This dye is really a fabulous product. If you haven't had a chance to work with it, I highly recommend you give it a try in one of your projects. I'll drop a link in the description below. I allowed the second coat of dye to dry overnight, and then came back the next day and gave each piece a very light sanding, just looking for any rough spots that might be left over in the finish. The next step in this process is going to be applying a water-based polyurethane top coat, and that's going to seal in this color and allow the pieces to be ready for the next step in this process, which is going to be applying the glaze. To spray the urethane on these drop leaf support brackets, I just put a couple of small dowels that fit the holes in these brackets in a scrap piece of wood. And that made a simple little jig that allowed me to put this urethane on Very quick and very easy. I allowed the urethane to dry for a couple of hours and then gave it a real light sanding to make sure I didn't have any dust particles settle in that first finish. And then I went ahead and used a Minwax oil-based stain in the color of ebony and went over the top of each of these pieces, and I immediately rubbed that finish off as soon as I put it on. So I'm looking just to tint the top. And this is really going to add to that depth of color that we're going for. Nice red and brown undertones. And this stain is going to highlight the different grain patterns of this maple and make for an absolutely beautiful top. And of course, I want to make sure that the drop leaves match the color of the top. So I'll hold those against the top just to make sure that I'm not applying too much stain or leaving too dark of a color. You can really see the color difference between that drop leaf bracket and the tabletop. I've gone from an orangish red color to a nice deep brown with red undertones. This glaze has really made a difference for this piece of furniture. I allowed that glaze to dry for a couple of days. So I used a penetrating oil stain as a glaze. And since I put a urethane top coat on this piece, it wasn't allowed to soak into the wood. So it did take a little bit longer to dry than maybe the can would indicate if you were to use it just as a regular stain. But at this point, I can go ahead and start to reassemble this piece. That's pretty simple. Just reverse the process as me taking it apart. All of my hinges and my screws and the panels are all labeled. So I know when I put this thing back together, everything is going to work just the way I intend it to. I did get a little bit of milk paint on these two wooden dowels that hold that drop leaf support bracket. So before I attempt to put that washer back on, I sanded that off with some sandpaper, and I used a screwdriver to help me put this back in place. Certainly a lot easier going back than it was when I took it off originally. And this is just a matter of lining up the screws. My trick for this is I start each screw just a little ways until I get all of the screws. And in this case, there were 6 screws on that hinge. I get them all started, and then I go back and tighten each one down. And that gives me a perfectly working hinge. And with that done, it's time to flip this guy over, and I'll get it ready for its final top coat. For the base of this table, I'm using a Satin urethane by Varathane. And I'll be spraying this on with my Wagner FLEXiO 5000. This little sprayer does a great job at laying down all kinds of finishes. It does especially well with these really thin urethanes. And I like to spray pieces like this that have all this detail work on the legs. That way I can prevent all the runs and drips that may happen if I was to use a paintbrush. I applied 2 coats, allowing the first one to dry about 30 minutes before applying the second. I'm finishing the top of this table with a semi-gloss polyurethane from Vermont Natural Coatings. I'm using a foam applicator to apply this urethane. It does a great job at leaving a nice thin layer of product with no brush strokes. And I could even use the edge of this applicator to work my way into the little cracks and crevices of this table. It end up with a uniform thickness finish all the way around. Alright guys, we've reached the end of this project, but before we get to the final reveal, let's remind ourselves where we started with this drop leaf table. And here it is, the top completely redone, the beautiful maple grain showing, nice semi-gloss top with a flat black base. Absolutely stunning piece of furniture. Well guys, I've appreciated your time spent today, and if you've enjoyed this video, which I'm sure you have, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like, maybe a subscribe, and we'll see you around for the next video. Take care.